Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so delighted you've joined me this evening for a lovely story, because nothing beats a good story, and I enjoy listening to stories just like you do, so I'm so glad you've joined me tonight. And don't forget to go and get yourself that effervescent sparkling drink or something warm and comforting, because I've got a lovely story. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Bernice, but everybody who knows me calls me Bernie, and I'm from Georgia, where I was raised by both my grandparents on their country farm that has been in my family line for generations, where we grow peanuts. It's a federal-looking red brick two-storey farmhouse which possesses similar features to a Georgian home with classical symmetry and a side-gabled roof. But it's a little bit more ornate looking and slightly taller and narrower. The house has white wooden double-hung windows, grey shutters and a grey roof, with fancy decorative undertrim, and about 3 red brick steps that lead to a stylish white front door that's framed on either side by very ornate columns and a rectangular overtrim. Our farm is surrounded by undulating green valleys and dotted with ubiquitous trees and a pond and a creek, as well as our own pristine greenwood full of sycamores, pines, dogwoods and hemlock trees, which are a haven for the indigenous wildlife like whitetails, raccoons, squirrels, foxes, bears, and the list goes on and on. I was removed from both my parents shortly after I was born, as both of them were drug addicts and were not deemed reliable enough to raise me. I'm heartily grateful that this finite decision was actually made on my behalf, as I dread to imagine where I would be today if that had not been the case. My biological grandparents on my mother's side were given sole custody in raising me as their own daughter. I was to learn that both biological parents of mine had lived in their shabby car, been homeless, slept rough, and on countless occasions OD'd on drugs. Sometimes my mother and her boyfriend, who was in fact my biological father, would actually get permission to come and visit me. I never considered them to be my parents. I remember my mother was the most scary-looking woman that I've ever seen. Her bedraggled, unkempt, slovenly appearance really terrified me as a young girl. She appeared to be so skeletal, and her atrophied bones were sticking out of her anemic flesh, rather like fragile daggers. Her haggard, wrinkled face was drawn and pinched, with hollow, indented cheekbones. If that wasn't bad enough, I promise you that her dull hair hung around her face in lifeless dreadlocks. Even her bloodshot eyes were rimmed with dark shadows. I noticed she wore a nose ring and possessed a tattoo on her arm of a skull and crossbones, which I thought was very sinister. As for my ungrounded, draggle-tailed father, he was always so dithery and spaced out. He looked like he was in another world. On one occasion I vividly recall that he was stroking a hydrangea bush, kissing and fondling it in the front yard. I actually asked my grandmother why he was displaying so much affection towards the bush. I heard my grandmother say, "Good grief! I've never seen anything like this before." She watched my father's antics through the window with a look of horror on her face. I don't believe she could quite comprehend what she was actually observing. I could tell that she was horrified by the inappropriate erotic love scene unfolding before our very eyes. It really looked like my enamoured father was having a lustful, very inappropriate love affair with a hydrangea bush, and he seemed to display amorous affection towards it by stroking it and looking at it with a bedazzled, besotted look on his face, and his impassioned behaviour got my grandmother all heated and fired up, especially when he kept telling the hydrangea bush over and over again how beautiful it was. "You're so beautiful! Oh, so beautiful, beautiful!" he drawled, stroking the leaves away gently, as if they were locks of hair on a woman's face. My grandfather, who was watching this passionate display of unbridled affection, and jovially joked that hydrangeas must indeed look rather desirable in a drugged, hallucinatory state. My grandmother immediately chastised him for not being at all funny. "Look what a complete fool the man is making of himself. Never in a month of Sundays have I seen such ridiculous, obscene behaviour. The man is completely off his head. He's an embarrassment to himself." On another occasion, I saw my delusional dad peeing over our white cat Snowball that was lying on the white couch fast asleep in the living room. The poor cat got the shock of her life when she was hosed down by my dad. The cat sprang up, lashed at my dad with her powerful claws, glaring at him with big yellow eyes, growling, and then bolted out of the living room like a rocket off a launch pad. My grandmother was furious with my dad. "What did you do that for?" she shrieked. "You've just peed over my beautiful Persian cat, and my couch too." "I thought it was a toilet bowl," he apologised. "It's a cat, for goodness sake," she snapped. "Get a pair of eyes, will you? Those drugs are doing all the seeing for you these days." "This isn't a good bat," she told my gran. "It's hard to distinguish what is real and what's not sometimes, and it did look like a toilet bowl," he protested. "I mean, it's all white, the couch and the cat." "She's a white cat," snapped my gran, "not a toilet seat." "Well, if you didn't do drugs," my grandmother informed him, "you might actually have a life and begin to live in the real world and use the correct facilities for your ablutions." Both my biological parents, without wishing to be unkind, looked like dossers or vagrants, as they wore soiled, worn-out, smelly clothes that were blistered with holes and tears. I noticed when they visited me, I never got the impression that they were the slightest bit interested in actually seeing me. Their visit would mask a rather insidious motive, and I wasn't wrong. You see, they really didn't care about anything else in the world other than the next high that they would get from their drugs. They preferred to sleep rough, rather than pay rent in order to procure more drugs. I never asked what they were taking, but I knew enough to know that even if you paid me $1 billion, I would not travel down that insidiously evil path. If my parents weren't so pathetic, I would have almost felt sorry for them. When they visited the farm, I do remember the growing tension in the air would be heightened and overwrought. My grandmother would become aggrieved, twitchy and stressed out. I would always sense that some kind of argument was ensuing, and my mother would storm out, screaming at my grandmother with cursory words that are not repeatable. I would watch my fuming parents climb into their battered, ruined-down old car. They would accelerate down the driveway at a mighty speed, causing the tyres to screech. After they had actually gone, I would look at my grandmother and could see that she had become so relieved. I would watch the crinkles on her brow straighten out as she visibly began to relax. I was to learn when I was older that my biological parents were always asking for money and handouts. They had literally cleaned my grandparents out on multiple occasions in the past by stealing televisions, jewellery and items of value that they would be able to pawn in exchange for money. I gather that they'd been arrested on multiple occasions stealing property from other people to support their out-of-control addiction. It grieved my grandparents' heart, as you can imagine, to turn their backs on their beloved daughter, but they believed that they had a moral responsibility to raise me in a very stable family environment and did not want the negative influences of my parents' drug-ridden lifestyle to drag me down or influence me negatively. On the contrary, it did the very opposite, as if you see the ramifications for what drugs can do to people, you would give them a wide berth. My grandparents' old-world farmhouse is delightfully charming, with lots of quirky character, and it's an old colonial home surrounded by pristine green turf that's manicured to perfection, a beautiful silvery pond, and a scattering of trees that border the perimeters of the long gravel driveway that winds its way to a large paved parking bay. The house itself has a colonial patio where statuesque decorative columns support the covered ceiling, and there are central steep steps that lead to an embossed decorative front door. Every window in our house overlooks magnificent views of hazy blue mountains that silhouette and frame the far distance of our property in undulating rectangular waves. The farm possesses prairies of idyllic grassland, meadows, white-poled fences, barns, ponds, and a large area of natural wood green that stretches back quite a way, with a meandering stream that jets through the valley, gushing over the rugged outcrops with a powerful, forceful current. In the 1800s, cotton was grown on my grandparents' property, and later it became a free-range chicken farm. But my grandmother did not like the smell, and so they decided to grow organic vegetables and raise orchards of peaches here instead. In those days, my grandfather developed a passion for beekeeping, and so we produced a great deal of our own honey, and it became a thriving, enterprising and productive business for us. My strange, rather peculiar story I'm about to share with you unfortunately didn't happen to me personally, but it happened to my grandmother on this very same farm when she was a teenage girl at the time. I only learnt about her story in 2010 when I was 17 years old. My grandmother was always a voracious, very fast knitter, and in the evening she would sit in the television room knitting away while I'd fiddle restlessly with the television control, scanning through all the television programmes, looking for something for us to watch, while my grandfather would be out playing bridge with some friends of his. "For goodness sake, sweetheart," my grandmother would chide, "you're worse than your grandfather, pressing the control every second. You're driving me stark raving mad. For goodness sake, find something decent for us to watch and stop clicking that control." One day my grandmother and I began to watch a programme on television about strange mysteries in Northern America, and one of the stories was all about the Yeti or the Sasquatch. Suddenly my grandmother's knitting needles began clicking very, very fast, and I heard her say, "Oh, I've dropped a stitch." I turned around to look at my grandmother in surprise, because she's never ever dropped stitches. That just doesn't happen. She's such a proficient knitter. When I looked at her, I knew something was off, and she was hiding something from me. It was like the story of the Yeti had somehow triggered a memory for her that she had repressed for some reason or other. "Do you think the Yeti is real?" I asked her, studying her expression ever so carefully. "Of course not," she said hurriedly, as if trying to avoid the question. "There's no such thing." I knew by my grandmother's telltale mannerisms that she was lying, and she wasn't good at telling untruths. "Gran," I said, "you've seen one, haven't you? I know you have." My grandmother was very reticent, contained sort of person, and getting her to tell you something very personal was like extracting blood from a stone. But after hours of constant badgering, her resistance wore thin. She finally conceded and confirmed that she had indeed encountered a Yeti, or a Bigfoot once, if you like, and I begged and begged her to tell me her story, until finally she did. "I can do better than that," she said to me, and went to retrieve a diary of hers. My grandmother did not keep diaries like normal folk do, that recorded their daily events one day after another. My grandmother's diaries were extra special because she only ever recorded the events of great significance in her life that she never wanted to forget. So this is the story she wrote in her diary, which I will now relate to you and your listeners in her own words. July 23rd, 1966. Yesterday, the 22nd of July, 1966. The day started like any normal day. I hadn't anticipated anything of an unusual nature happening or occurring. As usual, I woke up early and Mother was bustling around the kitchen and frying eggs and bacon sunny side up. The sizzling sweet smoky aroma wafted around the kitchen, permeating the air. If I wasn't hungry, I was now. Mother placed some bacon on a plate for me and poured me a yummy glass of chocolate milk, fresh from Morgan Roper's dairy herd, and it was absolutely delicious. Father had his head engrossed in the newspaper as usual and began to chuckle as he read out an article for us. "Listen to this," he laughed. "Farmer refuses to send his heifer to slaughter. Farmer Joe, like any other cattle rancher, has been raising heifers for many years, and his farm produces very fine quality lean succulent meat that would please the most discerning of palates. However, this year Farmer Joe is not sending one of his heifers called Chantilly Lace to the slaughterhouse. 'I can't do it,' he said. 'Chantilly Lace is one of the family now. She behaves just like a dog. She's affectionate and attentive. She rubs her large head against me and licks my bald patch with her long tongue. And the absent hair has grown back due to the follicle stimulation. I've never seen results like this before, and people are all commenting on the extraordinary miraculous regrowth of my hair, and it's all down to Chantilly Lace's massaging tongue. Farmer Joe says it's not just because my hair is growing back that I want to keep Chantilly Lace. It is by no means a vanity issue, but I'm just far too attached to her, and so are my wife and kids. If I sent her to the slaughterhouse, even my dogs would refuse to talk to me, because they also have taken to the heifer. She romps around with them, thinking she's a dog. She prefers to hang around us than with the rest of the herd. I've raised hundreds of heifers before, but Chantilly Lace is one in a million. They broke the mould when they made her. I don't think she even knows that she's actually a heifer. We think that the man protests too much, and the regrowth of his hair has increased his attachment to the feisty heifer. What do you think? We all began to laugh as Father read the article, and Mother suggested that he should visit Chantilly Lace for a head massage. "You could do with a little follicle stimulation," she teased, rubbing his bald patch. I could tell Father was not terribly amused or best pleased by my mother's brutal remark. He was always rather sensitive about losing his hair. It was about 11 o'clock when I told Mother I was going into the woods for some fresh air before luncheon to work up an appetite, and she told me it was a very good idea, because Father Lee Jones and his wife from church would be joining us for luncheon that day. I was bitterly disappointed because Father Lee is such a talkative person who always speaks in a monotone voice and reminds me of a droning lawnmower that just won't shut up. He goes on and on and on and on. As for his wife, I don't believe I've ever heard her say anything beyond, "Yes, dear." I think she's positively the most boring person that I've ever had the pleasure to meet. Why Mother keeps inviting them both over for lunch, goodness only knows. Maybe she wants a part in the church choir and is buttering him up. I wouldn't put anything past her. As I was meditating upon the tedium of lunch spent with that boring couple, I did determine that the woods had become very quiet. Even the trees failed to sway and rustle against the gentle breeze. The birdsong in the valley was not audible to my ears. I could hear the sound of the gushing stream meandering through the woods as the jets of boisterous water cascaded against the rocky outcrops. On this occasion it seemed louder than usual, possibly because everything else was airily still and very quiet. I did think it was decidedly odd, but I pondered no further upon the matter. I did, however, detect a musty smell in the woods that smelt like a damp towel or wet dog, so to speak, that had gone rather rank and mouldy. Suddenly I heard a snapping and huge screaming sound, unlike anything I've heard before. I knew immediately that one of Armstrong's illegal bear traps had gone off. Father has warned Armstrong time and time again that if he makes any more of those horrible homemade contraptions, that there will be hell to pay. I honestly don't know why my father did not get rid of the manic, insane Armstrong an awfully long time ago. The man's not right in the head. He's always making these ghastly, barbaric contraptions for trapping bears. They look like instruments of torture that are used in medieval times, that would be illegal if anyone uncovered what he was doing. He'd get into so much trouble. Weeks ago, poor Farmer Morris actually got his foot caught up in one of these gruesome traps, and he nearly lost it. Did the bull-headed Armstrong learn anything from that fiasco? Not at all. On the contrary, he continues to invent more and more of these ghastly, insidious and grotesquely evil traps. If I didn't know any better, I'd hasten to say that the man rather enjoys the savage and brutal way that he traps animals, which in my opinion is heinous and cruel. Hearing that horrible noise go off, I knew at once that someone was caught up in one of Armstrong's grievously evil traps. And whoever they were, it was most certainly not a bear. It sounded rather human-like. I knew that my father would finally be giving Armstrong his marching orders, and it couldn't come soon enough as far as I was concerned. Even his own wife told me once she won't let her husband anywhere near their cat, because she can't trust him to be gentle with the thing. I decided I needed to help the individual, whoever they were, that was stuck in the trap, as I more or less knew how to take Armstrong's medieval traps apart. Nothing on God's earth was to prepare me for what I was about to see. As I approached the area of the painful grunts, standing in the bear trap with one foot in the ghastly contraption was a colossal creature that bore a remarkable resemblance to a great ape, but it wasn't an ape. And it also bore a resemblance to a human, but it wasn't a human either. It was as if he was a combination of both man and beast. There are no words to describe what I saw to you, for he was a giant equal in strength to 4 men. He was about as wide and as big as our front door. I did discern that the beast was powerfully strong, for his body was made of solid, brawn, sinewy muscle, and was covered with long silvery grey hair, in all areas with the exception of the knees, the sides of his torso and face. I did determine that the weathered rough skin on his face was a deep grey colour, with lots of deep wrinkles, and his nose was flat on the face, with 2 open flares, and the mouth was long and very thin. I could see that the critter's large foot was ensnared in the trap, and he was trying to shake it off brutally with his foot, but every time he did this the trap tightened and caused the poor humanoid creature a great deal of pain. He was wincing a lot. I wanted to help the creature, but he was so terrifying to contemplate. I couldn't just leave him in the trap, though. He was now pulling it back with his fingers, which could potentially snap off if he wasn't careful. "No," I cried, raising my arms and venturing towards the creature. The creature looked up at me in surprise, and he winced. I could see the physical pain in his eyes, and I knew he was hurting, and I couldn't stomach the critter being in pain. My heart melted like butter, and despite my anguish and terrible fear, I no longer cared. I had to help this critter because it was so human-looking, and I couldn't leave it like this. I ran boldly towards the critter, no longer fearing for my own safety, as sometimes in life it's worth being a little courageous, and it certainly paid off for me in more ways than I could imagine that day. The critter began bending back the metal of the trap. I was astonished. How could he be strong enough to bend metal? Who can do that? Such was the strength of this creature. No, I said, don't do that. It could snap off your finger. I began to loosen the trap from the creature, as I knew exactly how the horrendous contraption worked, and I released the mechanism. The creature finally loosened its foot and stared at me in awe. I've never seen such a huge foot before, and it was actually bleeding quite badly. I felt very sorry for the creature. For a while the critter and I just stared at each other, and his golden eyes held my gaze for a very long time. His eyes expressed appreciation that I'd helped him, but also a very deep, gentle kindness that was so tangible I could feel it. He was definitely congenial and remarkably intelligent. I said to the creature, "Does it hurt?" And he looked at me with his beautiful warm eyes, and I melted like chocolate. I forgot that I was even afraid of him. He was scary and terrifying to perceive, based on his Herculean size and intimidating presence, yet his heart, I knew instinctively, was exceedingly good, and there was not even an ounce of malice in his demeanour. It was like the outer package did not correlate with his heart, for on the outside he was majestic, lofty and powerful like an apex predator, but the inside he was soft as a marshmallow. After a while the critter turned and indicated to me that he had to leave, and I watched him limping away. When I returned home for luncheon, I sat there in a dreamlike state, reliving my encounter with the marvellous creature, and wondering what on earth it was that he could be. I did not hear a word that the garrulous Father Lee had to say. I grinned at him and nodded, locked in my own fantasy world. Even my mother commented that I seemed less frustrated with Father Lee on this occasion, but she had no idea what was going on in my mind. If she had known, she would have been horrified. I told Father that I'd found Armstrong's homemade traps lying around the forest, and I was to find out there were others all equally as grievous and tortuous, hidden amidst the forest shrubbery. Father immediately dismissed him, and about time too. As I write this, I hope in my heart to see that extraordinary creature again, but I do not believe it is likely, but I know that I shall never ever forget him as long as I live. I shall not tell anybody what I've seen, and I highly doubt that if I did, they would even believe me. I will never forget his pyramid-shaped head, large shoulders and angular face, with the most beautiful eyes that I have ever beheld. P.S. Footnote. 5 days have passed since I last saw the creature, but my mother found several eagle feathers on our doorstep and wondered where on earth they'd come from. I took them from her at once, telling her they were for me, because I knew that they were. I can hardly believe that the creature brought me a gift. I'm so happy, because eagle feathers are a token of strength and power, and I shall definitely treasure them all my life. So there you are. That was my grandmother's personal story. I was to learn that she never saw the Bigfoot again, which was why she was so upset watching the documentary on the Yeti. She was very cross and incensed because the person talking about the Sasquatch kept claiming that they were all nasty, vicious, dangerous monsters. My grandmother vehemently believes that this is not the case. He was so kind, she protested, so kind. And his eyes, I'll never forget those eyes. They were beautiful. They're so misunderstood, she said. So there you are. That's my story. Thank you, Bernice, for that incredible story. That Armstrong guy sounds like a really insidious man. Honestly, doing that to trap an animal and cause them so much grievous pain, that really makes me mad to the stomach. But anyway, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.